Hi, good morning to all of you. Thanks to all of you for joining us and those watching online as well. And thank you both to Vera and Shoshana, who have been in the mix on this issue for a long time. So Vera, I wanted to start with you because we were looking at all the states across the country that have passed laws recently around age verification, requiring social media platforms to get some sort of proof of a user's age. And we've seen a host of legal challenges brought around some of these issues. So I wanted to get a sense from you, why is this a problem? Why is the ACLU challenging some of these provisions when kind of theoretically you would think, oh, that seems like a good idea. Why shouldn't, parents or kids be required to prove their age, especially to prevent them from being exposed to certain products, to certain content? What do you see as the problems there?
Thank you for the question. Thank you for having me and for letting me join on screen. It's a funny thing to be in a hybrid meeting, but I appreciate it. I think it's a good and important question. I'm a parent. I certainly care about protecting my kid. I think one thing that is important to keep in mind in all of this is that actually enabling kids to access information, to engage online, to learn, to make up their own minds, to meet other people and join in community is part of protecting them. It's part of protecting them right now. It's part of encouraging them and enabling them to be part of our democratic society in the future. And so I think that's just a big piece of what matters here that sometimes gets missed when we're talking about protecting kids from dangerous ideas or dangerous mediums. I think the other thing to keep in mind is that this isn't our first rodeo. There have been a lot of efforts to do this by the government to protect kids from comic books, from drive-in movies, from video games, and for the most part, courts have held all of those efforts to be unconstitutional, getting to your more legal question, and that's really for two reasons. One is that, especially when we're talking about communication online, what attempts to protect kids or limit what kids can see online does is limit what everyone can see, what everyone can do online. So this is about burdening kids' ability to engage, which, like I said, I think really matters. But it's also about restricting adults' use of information that no one is arguing is illegal for them to access or even necessarily dangerous for them to access. It means robbing people of anonymity, exposing them to security harms, and for some people making it impossible to access ideas at all.
So what's at stake in the Supreme Court case on this issue that you're involved with regarding a law in Texas when it comes to certain age verification requirements?
So that case is called Free Speech Coalition versus Paxton, and it is about age verification on adult sites. And the question is essentially, can the government burden adults' access to fully protected speech in its efforts to protect kids from dangerous ideas, which I think is squarely part of what we're talking about today. And the court has answered that question before in at least two cases specifically about the internet, Reno versus Ashcroft and Ashcroft versus Free Speech Coalition, and it has said no. So we are very hopeful that it will say the same thing again. The Fifth Circuit opinion that we are appealing from is quite an outlier in this space.
Got it. And Shoshana, I wanted to turn it to you in terms of how you see this issue, because you're coming at it from more of sort of a social, cultural perspective for youth, looking at protections from them, but almost on the other side where perhaps some of these sort of blunt tools to regulate these platforms could have unintended consequences. Where do you stand on that?
For sure. So the First Amendment issues are really problematic, and I'm glad that we had Vera to talk about them. But there's also major cybersecurity issues. One thing I've been looking into a lot is child identity theft, which is a really big problem because kids don't check to make sure that they're not victims of fraud. No one's thinking that a kid's gonna have that kind of issue, but it's a really, really big problem. And with age verification, especially when you have to confirm consent from the parent for anything, to make sure the parent's the parent and the child's the child, there's no way to do that without identity verification. And that means social security numbers, government IDs. And one of the big systems used to do that, that I think is pronounced Authentics, it has numbers in the name, it was breached for over a year and a half before I started working on this, and it was wide open for anyone with credentials to go in and pick out government IDs, social security numbers, tie it to the account. Of children and adults too, both. And it creates this massive cybersecurity risk that even if you're not concerned about adults, I mean, this is a huge issue for kids to be able to get this information, tie it together, use it for fraud, and there's ways the government can combat that too. But I'm really concerned about if we're trying to protect kids online, let's start with not making it worse. And let's also, like Vera was saying, let's protect their ability to access information. For myself, I started networking with elected officials when I was 14 on social media, because I was like that at 14, and I used it to find medical answers. And there's so many positive uses for kids that it has to be up to the parent. And I'm all for parental controls, but when the government mandates it, that's when you force identity verification. But if parents do it of their own volition, then they can just say, hey, come over here and make sure their accounts are connected.
So where do you see the balancing act? Because obviously, I think, most people in this room can agree, we all want to protect kids, we all want to protect young people from certain content, from being exposed to marketing around certain products. So where do you see the ability to do that and to regulate that while also maintaining access for them for the things that do help them in ways that you described?
I mean, I think something I love is that Dr. Gottlieb was talking about having the working group of platforms, and it has to be big and small, because some of the worst stuff happens on the smallest platforms, but some great stuff happens on smaller ones, like even All Trails, where kids can learn to hike, or GitHub, where kids can learn to code with adults and stuff. So I think that we need to have all the platforms, all the kinds of platforms in the room, and talk together about best practices. I'm not saying there can't be regulation, just every proposal I've seen has these massive holes that make things worse, especially from a privacy and security angle. But one thing the government can do to protect kids online and in general is just one super simple stuff. One, the Social Security Administration could check Social Security numbers before issuing them, so they don't issue a lifetime of fraud and criminal history to kids. Make sure foster care youth are more protected in a similar vein. And the IRS should tell parents when their child's identity is being used for fraud, and the IRS refuses to tell parents even though they're required by law. It's not.
And you were saying before that's because kids aren't taxpayers.
Right.
So they're not sending the government money.
Right. That's the argument they gave. And I know it's not exactly children online, but I think if we got there and if we got to a better state of cybersecurity, then we could talk a little bit more about if we wanted to do deeper age verification. But I mean, this is, before we even get there, we have to make sure that we're not setting up kids to be just massive victims, even in lighter cases. Yeah.
And Vera, I wanted to talk to you about what's been happening here in Washington recently outside of the states, where we saw the Senate pass major legislation for the first time in years regarding child online safety. They've sort of revamped the Children Online Privacy Act to sort of expand the ages that are covered, going up from 13 years old. Where do you see those rules? Obviously, we're not quite sure if they'll actually pass Congress, given they're preoccupied with some other things. But do you see those rules as also being problematic on top of some of the things that the states have done?
So I think there are certainly things that are happening at the federal level that are problematic. I think that any law that is aimed at restricting access to harmful or dangerous ideas that is content-based will be subject to strict scrutiny, to use some legal terms, and I think will almost certainly fail. I think there are real problems, like I said, with the government saying these particular ideas are just too dangerous for people to engage with. These particular ideas are likely to cause anxiety, or we're worried about exposing kids to feelings of depression. I feel anxious reading the news, and I think it's still important for me to read the news. And I think at the same time, efforts I can't say that there's a specific effort that I think is quite on the right path, but I do think that in the world of regulation, consumer privacy regulation is another important and viable path to go down. I think that there's actually a lot of overlap. I think that passing good, strong consumer privacy regulation that, for example, uses data minimization, that requires the highest privacy settings by default, that gives users the default of not having a lot of information collected and then used to target ads, to target information towards them, but that also gives them the option to opt in if they want to. I think those are all good and important paths forward. I'm not sure that that's exactly where the focus is right now.
Yeah, so you think a little bit more sort of limited, giving more options and not being so broad in sort of their prescriptions of how these things should be implemented.
And not focusing so much on the content that is being communicated through the platforms, but rather the ways that the platforms are engaging with their users, the types of information that the platforms are slurping up from people that people might not know about, might not want to be sharing, kind of placing guardrails there. And I think for the lawyers following along, I think Net Choice versus Bonta, which is a recent opinion from the Ninth Circuit, is an interesting teasing apart of exactly these issues. It looks at restrictions aimed at platforms providing access to quote unquote harmful information. It says those are content-based, that's a real problem. And then it separates out the regulations that I would say seem more squarely focused at actually protecting users' privacy, and says you need to analyze those differently, court below, they might actually be okay.
Got it. And Shoshana, what about you in terms of the recent actions from Washington? Is that sort of a path forward to getting to a better place? Do you feel like it's too sort of broad and the burdens it sort of puts on platforms, as you know, as Vera was saying, sort of if something causes anxiety or depression, well, you know, you can get that from watching the news these days, unfortunately. Where do we draw the lines?
For sure. So it's interesting, the sponsors of COSA refused to admit that it was an age verification bill and said, no, this is not an age verification bill. Then the CRS report came out and said, this age verification bill. I'm like, all right, let's be honest about what we're talking about. But anxiety and depression can be caused by all different things. I mean, a lot of people have climate anxiety, news in general, but all kinds of stuff. Medical news can give people anxiety, and I think that that's, I mean, it just gives a door for censorship and First Amendment issues. I love the privacy angle, and I think a really important principle here is not to divide child privacy from adult privacy, because then you need to figure out who's a child, who's an adult. Skip all that and privacy for everyone, not just because it's good for everyone, but because the task of dividing out children and adults lead us back to the problems of age assurance and age verification. So when you come at privacy that way, I think it helps a lot. And not that, you know, there has to be some nuance within there, but I think that should be a really big guiding principle. And that that COSA, that other similar bills that keep trying to segment out children recreate the same problems.
So really it should be protections for all.
Right.
Got it. Well, thank you so much for those viewpoints.
Thank you so much for having me.